Amen, and good evening and good morning to all of you. Pleasure to have you again on the platform, and it's a privilege for me to be back on the platform today. Let me lead in the study, and I was grappling with this um, very profound subject called the justice of God, and this was one of our the questions that I think some of you had raised. And so I'm looking at it probably a little bit more philosophically because it's not an easy subject to deal with. So, what I wanted to do was to pick up some aspects of it and then try to see if I can provide some understanding on it as much as we can do so. Um, so, the what do you call the image I sent you, the title is actually a verse from Job chapter 40, where God, speaking to Job, says, "Would you discredit or annul my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself?" Now, we'll come to that. So that's what intrigued me talking about justice. But if you remember, I had done one session on this where I had contrasted the world's justice with God's justice. How does the world look at the subject of justice? And I'll just give you one or two points to recap. The world looks at justice uh, purely from the perspective of fairness, right? The world believes that fairness is what should be the focus of justice. In other words, you reward the good and you punish the bad, right? In other words, it's basically retributive or rewarding. It rewards goodness and it punishes the bad. So that is, in short, how the world looks at justice. But from God's perspective, justice is based on His intrinsic nature of love, right? The justice of God is rooted in His goodness. And so we can say God's justice goes beyond fairness. It is not just fair. You could sometimes say that it might seem unfair, but God's justice includes compassion, mercy, righteousness, forgiveness. So God's justice goes much, much beyond fairness. And if we can use one word which is normally used within Christian theology, it's restorative. It is not just retributive, but it is restorative. And we will look at those words as we go along. So, obviously, when we look at God's justice, there is a mystical element to it, isn't it? Like I was just telling you, sometimes God's justice may seem unfair or unjust. If you look at it from the world's perspective of fairness, um, the way God dispenses his justice may seem unfair. And so I want to pick up this perspective of God's justice from the story of Job. Right? Many of us have read the book of Job, and now I know that when we read the book of Job, there's sometimes more questions are asked rather than finding answers. But anyway, let us see how we can decode, if I can use that word, what God is trying to tell us about his justice. So thanks for walking with me, exploring with me. Once again, I must mention that I do not have all the answers to this very, very profound question, subject, but I'm hoping that as we go along, we can embrace the mystery because there is a mystical element in God's justice. Okay, let's get to uh, the narrative of Job. Now, once again, uh, you are all very familiar with the book of Job. He was a rich man, successful, in the way we would describe justice, or rather success from a worldly point of view. He seemed to be a very contented man, except sometimes he was very upset with his children, perhaps, because they enjoyed parties. And when the party was over, he was afraid they may have broken some laws of God, and so he used to sacrifice on their behalf so that God would not be upset with them. Um, so he had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And of course, he had a very critical wife. Nothing much is said about the wife, but with the little we know, the wife seemed very, very critical. Now, how does the story turn? The story turns to Job's dramatic losses, right? He loses everything, and we know that uh, the mention of Satan is there in the book, uh, but I am not going to focus on Satan because I want to completely focus on God's justice and the questions that Job asks, right? So I'm not going to get into Satan, even though we know that Satan is the person behind, the player behind the scene, causing all the destruction. And of course, when Job loses all his wealth, he also suffers the loss of all his children, and then his own health. As he sits on that garbage pile, his wife walks by and she says, "Why don't you curse God and die?" Right? In other words, perhaps she is thinking that God is to blame for his misfortune and indirectly her misfortune, because when he loses it all, she also loses. And so she says, "Curse God, because God is no good to you, and die." In other words, "You're useless to me. Why don't you just die?" All right. So that is how the wife responds. Now, what happens next? Well, in his misery, there are 3 friends that come, and they sit with him to console him. The friends, of course, you remember, accuses him. And I would like to just take a moment to mention the names of the friends. And the way the name of the friends are written in the Bible is interesting. Notice the 3 friends are Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Namathite. Now you remember there is a 4th chap, a young fellow called Elihu. And the way Elihu's name is mentioned, Elihu, son of Barakal, the Buzite, of the family of Ram. Interesting, Ram is mentioned. I'm presuming it must be a derivative of Abraham, right? So some connection with Abraham, probably. I just paused for a moment and wondered, why would the Bible give such detail of these people? Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and of course there is a joke that this is the shortest man in the Bible because he was only Shuhite. just an aside. And of course Zophar the Namathite. I'm just wondering if maybe this is given so that we recognize that this is a factual story, because there is detail which is not like a fairy tale. It doesn't start by saying once upon a time there was a man, and but it gives extremely, fine details. So perhaps we could say, once again, this is only a speculation. It could be a factual story. All right. So we have come to that point where Job is now sitting in his pain. He has these three friends who speaks to him, and he also speaks, and he says, "I don't understand why God is doing this to me." Right? He he sort of displays his pain so much that he comes to the point of demanding an answer from God. And if I can just pick up a verse from Job 31, and in verse 35, it says, "Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing." So he is now coming to the point where he boldly asks for an answer, and he expects God to answer him. And of course, in the course of the conversations that takes place, the three of his friends very clearly accuses him and say that, you are to blame. There is some sin that you have committed, because that was the normal understanding, that when somebody suffers, it is because of the mistakes or the sins that that person has committed. Now, once again, let me drop down to the question that Job asks. He demands from God an answer. Let the Almighty answer me. And you all remember that God now enters the scene, right? Uh, God enters the scene, and what does he do? Well, he speaks, certainly, but does he give any answer to the questions that Job is asking, right? All God does is narrate cosmic events, right? But there is no specific answer to the question that is being asked, right? So the way the book of Job captures the discourse or the answer that God gives is, of course, you know, beyond, I should say, it's superlative, it is superlative poetry. In fact, I was just looking at to try to find out what is the literary style, or you could say, we use the word genre. What is this literary style that God uses to answer Job? And in the Encyclopedia Britannica, it says the answer that rather God gives, is the finest expression of the Hebrew poetic genius. It must also be accorded a place among the greatest masterpieces of world literature. So hopefully a Nobel Prize is necessary. Nobel Prize in literature, perhaps. I was also trying to understand the genre, the literary style, and I found out that there is somebody who did some research, and it is an Indian. Her name is Sugandhi Hepzibah. She is a PhD research scholar, and I'd like you to see what she says about the literary style of this poetic response of God. And I'll just bring up I just share with you what I have on my screen. Let me see if you can see it. Hopefully you can see that. Is it big enough? Right. Praveen, is it okay? Right. Yeah, I can't hear you, Praveen. Right.
Hi. For computer, it is fine. For people who are in mobile, they may not be able.
Yeah, right. So let me read it for you, those of you who are on mobile. Let me read it for you. Notice it says the unique literary form of the book of Job. And it says the following: the book of Job has a unique literary form since it includes poetry and prose with different features of drama, epic, and lawsuit. It forms a genre by itself. The book of Job is a combination of poetry and prose. The first and the final part of the book are in prose, while the middle part is in poetry. The prologue and epilogue are in prose, and the main part is made up of the three cycles of dialogue and poetry. The book as a whole is set in a prose narrative framework within a poetic core in the middle. I just wanted to impress you with the the very high literary style that is adopted in the book, and of course the response of God comes out, in that poetic style. And let me just take a few moments to read parts of that response, just for us to get a feel of how God is responding to Job. And I'm going to chapter 38, and I will read just a few thoughts from there. Notice it says, then the Lord spoke to Job, beginning in verse 1, out of the storm. He said, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. I mean, notice the sarcasm that is used. Tell me if you understand. God is asking Job. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know, another sarcasm. Who stretched the measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. And dropping down to verse 16. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all of this. I thought I'll just read a part of that just for us to get a feel of the thundering voice of God. Can you imagine God speaking in that particular form? So, question: what is the answer to these profound questions God is putting forward to Job in response to what Job is asking him? He wants the Almighty to answer, and here is Job now. I mean to say, God now posing these many sets of questions, all something to do with uh, the creation. And apparently, I'm told there is a movie that's been made. It's called The Tree of Life, and I don't have access to it. I tried it on YouTube, but I don't have access to it. Maybe it's on Netflix. Maybe you should try it. The Tree of Life is a movie that has been made that tends to bring out the intricacies of the book of Job. So maybe you want to have a look at that when you have time. So once again, coming to the question, what is God trying to do here? Right? He is asking questions that we don't have answers to. Right? So what is this? How is God being just? What is this justice of God that when Job asks, why am I suffering? And he answers in this manner. In fact, the fourth, you remember there was the fourth chap, Elihu, he understands that we can never fully fathom the, the answer to the question, why am I suffering? Why is there so much of suffering? Let me just give you a sampling of his response. Elihu says, and I'm picking this up from Job chapter 36. He says, how great is God beyond our understanding. The number of his years is past finding out. He draws up the drops of water, which distills as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture, and abundant showers fall on mankind. Who can understand how he spreads out the clouds, how he thunders from his pavilion? See how he scatters his lightning about him, bathing the depths of the sea. Once again, profound poetry. But Elihu seems to understand uh, that understanding this response of God is beyond human comprehension. So, what can we conclude? Once again, now I'm getting to the meat of the study. What can we conclude? This is how I understand it. Once again, there may be speculation here. So I confess that I have to speculate. So this is how I see it. God is basically declaring or portraying himself as eternal. If he is an eternal God, his perspective is eternal. If his perspective is eternal, his justice has an eternal aspect, an eternal element. If his justice has an eternal element to it, mortal man like you and me, and like Job, can never fully comprehend the full understand or get the full understanding of God's eternal perspective. Right? So I think we can fairly conclude, even though this is a speculation, we can never fully fathom the vastness of God's perspective. The least we can say, from what we have read is all the words that we may use, all the explanations we may give is inadequate. All the words we can utilize to explain the justice of God is simply inadequate, right? All our words are never sufficient to explain God's justice. That is why I titled my study, The Mystery of God's Justice. In other words, God's justice will remain a mystery for us. But I use the verse from Job chapter 40, verse 8. And I go back to that. And how can we understand that? What is God saying in chapter 40, verse 8? He says, would you discredit my justice? Would you annul my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? He's asking Job. He's asking all of us. Can we discredit the justice of God because we don't understand it? Can we condemn God to justify ourselves because we are not able to comprehend the eternal perspective of God? Right? So, what is the answer to that? So uh, this answer that God is, or this verse, first and foremost, we must realize God is not dismissing Job's pain. God's response, in all his response, he does not dismiss Job's suffering. He in one sense, is acknowledging that Job is going through an extremely hard time. There's no doubts about that. But God is providing a perspective that transcends human ideas of fairness. Now, remember, I said we only look at justice from the point of view of fairness. But God's justice, like I said earlier, goes beyond fairness. So this story helps the readers to understand that God's justice is not always reflected in immediate circumstances, right? God does not address the immediate circumstance of Job, even though he recognizes it. God's justice cannot be measured by human standards alone, right? And so I would conclude that Job chapter 40, verse 8, the verse that I used for my study, is a reminder for us that we don't have to understand everything to trust God's justice. That is, I think, something that I would like to re emphasize. Perhaps God is helping us to see that we don't have to fully understand and comprehend everything to trust God and to trust that God is just. Because His justice, like I said, has an eternal perspective which may be mystical for us. But of course, we come back to the human dilemma. What is the human dilemma? We want to believe that suffering is a direct punishment for sin. That is the normal human perspective, and it was there in the time of Job, and you can see that in the answers of the three friends. It is even existent today. All of us still believe that when we suffer, it's a direct punishment for sin. But that is the human dilemma, and that is not what is God's answer to us, right? And so, because of that, when God is silent, when God does not give us a specific answer in the face of injustice, what do we conclude? We conclude that that is injustice, that God is not just. You know, there is a saying in the justice system. They say justice delayed is justice denied. Right? Now, if you use that when we look at God's justice, then obviously we can find fault with God. But then God is saying in that question, Job, Job 40, verse 8, would you discredit my justice? Can you annul my justice? Because justice may be delayed. My justice may seem like injustice. Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Can we say the world's justice condemns God? Yes, in some ways it does. But can we do that? And so that is where we are left with a human dilemma. And sometimes, I should say, God's grace seems like injustice to us, isn't it? When God provides grace, especially to the perpetrator, you remember Jesus Christ on the cross. What did He say? One of His words were, God, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I mean, Father, forgive them. What kind of justice is that? But Jesus says they know not what they do. That seems like injustice because they were perpetrating murder. So His grace may seem like injustice to us. Okay, having said all of that, now let me then come to some concluding thoughts. I hope that I've not left you completely confused. But let me come to some concluding thoughts. Let's look at the whole story now. Now I want to bring the whole story, okay? How does the story end? We know the story ends by Job being restored to full health. He is given double of what he had and what he lost. He is given the double of the sheep that he had and the camels that he had and the donkeys he had. Right? What can we say about God's justice there? Can we say God's justice is restorative? Because He restores not just what He had, but double. God's justice has a restorative element in it. So, what can we conclude? God's justice is never wanting. Nobody will be shortchanged. Nobody will be shortchanged for what they suffer. His justice, God's justice, is more than justice as we see it from a worldly perspective. God's justice is grace. Grace. And that's a powerful word in the Bible. Let me just pick up a few more thoughts. You notice the children are restored, or rather, he gets back his children. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? He had 10 children, seven sons, 3 daughters. And all of them are restored to him. But it never mentions another wife. It never mentions multiple wives. Where did he get his children from? Exact amount. 10 children he had. 7 sons, 3 daughters. Where did he get this from? You know, scholars, I mean, with the little that we understand from reading scholars speculate that this is actually a resurrection. That is the speculation that scholars make. It is not mentioned in the book, but they say if it has to be 7 and 3, 10, no wives mentioned, could it be a resurrection? God's justice is restorative. 2 final thoughts, and I'll end. Because of what we are seeing and speculating, again, scholars come and say, Job perhaps may be a type of Jesus. What do we understand from Jesus? Suffering and resurrection. Right? Loss, apparent loss, but restoration. So there is a type of Jesus in Job. So through Jesus, we see that God's justice is ultimately redemptive, bringing life and resurrection, even though there is death and destruction and pain. One more important thought I want to leave with you. You see, why does God give those profound, or rather displays his profound questions? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Why is God doing that? Why is God using such poetic words, obviously, but using, questions that we mortal human beings cannot answer? Is it possible? Once again, speculation. Scholars seem to indicate that what God is trying to help us understand is this, that only God, by bringing up those questions, he is trying to help us understand that only God has the ability to handle the deep, mysterious, profound aspects of life. There are many aspects of life that are beyond our capability to fully fathom. He wants us to realize that only he has the ability to answer the questions that he himself poses. And hence he wants us to trust him. Right? And that is the reason why he did not want mankind to eat of the tree of good and evil. The tree of good and evil is probably symbolic of aspects of life that we cannot handle. He did not want us to take of that, but yet we did. And so he's coming back to say, we cannot handle it. We have to trust God to handle it. Only he has the power and the perspective to handle it. So, to conclude, I go back to that verse, Job chapter 40, verse 8. Would you discredit or annul my justice, God asks? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? And so we have to answer, how can we discredit God's justice? God's justice may seem unjust to us, but in the final analysis, he restores double. His justice is restorative in the eternal sense. His eternal perspective is something that we cannot fully see. He also asks, would you condemn me to justify yourself? Our justice is short sighted. The justice of this world is short sighted, but God's justice is eternal. His perspective is eternal. Ours is limited, and hence we cannot justify with any question we can use to condemn God. And so I leave it there. Once again, one more perspective with regards to the justice of God. I may bring some more and perhaps leave you with some more philosophy. Okay, thank you very much. Let's open it up for any thoughts, reflections, questions, which I may not have answers to, but nevertheless, I'd welcome anything you can add to it. I've been very careful to try to help you understand that a lot of it is speculative. There may be some thoughts you might have to, you might uh, provide. Go ahead.